What's up, everybody? Little stream for a little bit. Um, I'm thinking. that I might cover a video that a guy I went to school with did. I've done this on my channel a couple of times. I don't know. I'm thinking about it. But before we do, I wanted to take a look at this story. Tesla, obviously fairly relevant these days. It's a shame, it's a shame for many reasons. I wanted Tesla to be good. Oof. I wanted them to be like world changing with the great cars and all this stuff. I used to read the Oatmeal many years ago, and he wrote about how he had a Tesla and it was super cool and exciting and fast, and I wanted Tesla to be good, and the cars seem to be okay, right? They're fast. They do have better range than a lot of other electric cars, or at least than they used to have. And there was this idea that Elon was going to be a tech wizard and save the world with his amazing tech. And that hasn't happened, right? And instead, what has happened is Elon has become a complete right-wing lunatic. Always was, and hit it, it's hard to say. He was very much virtue signaling to the right. But before, he was virtue signaling to the left, right? Because he's trying to make money. This is the way of things. Assalamu alaikum, Sharif. I hope you're doing well. We're going to look at this story for a minute. What's up, Alex? I was just telling my parents about this, actually. They were in town over the weekend, and I mentioned this story. I haven't read it further, but I saw several quotes get posted. Tesla was found partly liable in a wrongful death lawsuit involving the death of a pedestrian. The automaker claimed that it did not have the fatal crash's data until a hacker was able to recover the data from the crashed car. So something that has come out. Yes, this is the one in Florida. Something that has come out in recent weeks, I guess, is that Tesla has a really unique way of taking crash data and uploading it to their servers and then erasing it from the car. In effect, right? We'll get into it. It's worth reading stories, I've been hearing all of this stuff about how people don't read and people can't read anymore. Well, I fucking can. And I will read through this. In the past, Tesla's been famously quick to offer up data stored on its servers to rebut claims made against the company. But in this case, the company said it had nothing. Specifically, the lawyers from the family wanted what's known as the collision snapshot, data captured by the car's cameras and other sensors in the seconds leading up to and after the crash. Teslas have a lot of technology, right? And they have a bunch of, at this point, they're basically webcams. But they have a bunch of cameras in the car. So it's sort of like a body cam, in effect, right? You could get the data leading up to the crash from the internal recording system. According to the trial, moments after the collision snapshot was uploaded to Tesla's servers, the local copy on the car was marked for deletion. Then, someone at Tesla probably took affirmative action to delete the copy of the data on the company's central database. All that means is it says it was marked for deletion, right? And if that's an accident and it auto deletes, then that's one thing. But if it's marked for deletion and then somebody goes in specifically to remove that file, that's not an oversight, right? That's intention. If it just like if your database or your servers have a rule, right? So whenever something gets uploaded and gets marked for deletion, after 24 hours or after 6 hours, it'll just be auto deleted, right? It'll just automatically go to the trash. That is careless, right? That is reckless. And you could make an argument that that shouldn't be allowed, but it may or may not be. Assalamu alaikum, Salma. Man, we got everybody together today. The whole gang is here. Congratulations on doing well in your exam, Sharif. Anyway, somebody going in and physically taking an action to ensure the removal of data, that is a cover-up, right? So that is significant. If it is true that somebody had to go in and delete it on purpose, that is significant. Tesla only acknowledged it had received the data once the police took the Tesla's damaged infotainment system and autopilot control to a Tesla tech to diagnose. At that time, the local collision snapshot was considered unrecoverable. That's where the hacker, who is still on X, blah blah, told the Post that for any reasonable person it was obvious the data was there. During the trial, Tesla told the court it hadn't hidden the data but lost it. Right, so this is kind of what I was referring to. Yeah, absolutely. They are using all of us as guinea pigs, right? It's beta testing at scale. But this is what I was alluding to. If you just lose the data, that's one thing. If your systems auto delete, you run auto cleanup every so many hours, right, to make sure that all of your data is up to date or that you're reducing the demand on your storage. You can make an argument about it. If that is your position, then that's like sloppy, right? But it's not necessarily malicious. But if somebody is going in and manually removing what becomes incriminating data, that is malicious. So the argument that Tesla's trying to make is that we messed up. Oops, we goofed, And this is so funny. This is I think that like reading is really interesting. Salma, my life, we have moved. I now live in another state, a much more beautiful state. I've been going outside a lot. One of the reasons I have not been streaming regularly is because we have not yet installed wireless internet in our apartment. So I am using some limited hotspot data to stream occasionally. But we will, hopefully, I have had a couple interviews. I've had several interviews. Most of them have been useless, but hopefully I will have some more productive conversations this week and have some income again. And when that happens, I will have a regular schedule and I'll be able to figure stuff out. But this last line here is such a lie, but it's the sort of lie that you have to tell, because what you're trying to communicate is we didn't do anything wrong. We are all looking for the guy who did this. We are all trying to find out what happened here, and we're just as upset as you that this data wasn't available, right? So the lawyer for Tesla, after saying that another search, right, we said we didn't have it, but after this guy disclosed that we did have it, we were able to find it mysteriously. We went back in and what do you know? We found it. And so he says, we didn't think we had it, but we found out we did. And thankfully we did, because this is an amazingly helpful piece of information. That last part is it's very funny, because it is absolutely not helpful to Tesla. It is very much detrimental, which is why they were trying to hide it. But because the lawyer can't admit that, they have to just be like, oh man, we thought we didn't have it, but we did. Isn't that great? We certainly weren't trying to hide it. It's not really funny, right? Because somebody died, and Tesla's trying to cover up their responsibility in the death of a pedestrian. I don't know if evil is correct. It's probably below evil, but that's pretty heinous. But what is funny is the way they have been caught so clearly on this that they just kind of have to go, hey, it's great. It's great that we found this, actually. All right. Some other stuff. I really like this website, by the way. If you're interested in tech news, science news, Ars Technica is really good. As far as I am aware, they are still resisting AI content, which is great. I hope that stays, But I mean, there is some really interesting stuff that they talk about. Wow, I could get Ars Technica Pro. I'm not going to do that. Okay, well, I'm thinking about doing this video. Oof, very exciting, Salma. Just take deep breaths, and I will say, I have never tried to drive in Morocco. I have seen what traffic is like in India and in other countries that have had cars for a shorter period than we have had in America. So it can be pretty exciting. So I hope you are safe. And then you'll be able to drive. And you'll have all kinds of freedom. I don't know. Does anybody want me to talk about religion? I guess Corey did a long video that I'm not going to watch about, I don't know, Jordan Peterson and Alex O'Connor. Alex O'Connor, a person I still have not engaged basically at any point with. He seems to be like the new Richard Dawkins, right? Or Hitchens. At least two right-wingers. Because he is like a really, I don't know, vocal atheist who is debating people and trying to prove that the God isn't real. I don't believe God is real, but I also don't really care that much about online debate perverts. I respect Bart Ehrman a lot. I will watch some of his debates because he is a scholar. First and foremost, he is a scholar who comes from a background in Christianity, in evangelical Christianity. So he has a depth of knowledge as somebody who was in the world of Christianity and has also advanced degrees and helped with the translation of the New Revised Standard Edition. So I think he is a person worth listening to because he knows what he's talking about. But for the most part, I'm not interested in this sort of performative debate stuff on, whether it's online or it's on college campuses. I don't think it's very useful on either side. Who wants to go listen to Charlie Kirk talk about how women should be having more babies, right? Who wants to hear that? Who wants to hear somebody argue with him? Only people who have a lot of free time. But this was interesting. I looked at the comments on this one. He has taken, this is a clip of his longer video, according to the description. The Bible condones slavery. Now, what's interesting, Well, we'll watch it. I have seen. I looked at the comments. All right, because I wanted to see what the temperature was on this. People do not seem largely to think that he made very compelling points, but I haven't watched it yet. So I can't speak to that specifically. I have watched a few videos from people like Dan McClellan, people like Bart Ehrman, talking about Joshua Bowen, right, who's a professor of Assyriology, talking about how the Bible does explicitly condone not just slavery, but chattel slavery. It is explicitly condoned in the Bible. And we can talk about how it shouldn't be, or how that was a different time, or how it was. I'm prefacing the video with this so that you know where I stand, all right? Before we get into it, you can argue that the Bible was a product of its time. You can argue that it was never the best system. It was just a system that God allowed. You can argue that it was different kind of slavery than it is now, and there were different rules on how you were supposed to treat people. You can argue those things, but you are lying if you do that. You are either lying or you are misinformed. Here's the thing, okay? I've talked about this with my partner some, because we both come from evangelical backgrounds. Her dad is also a preacher, and but from a different denomination, but we come from similarly focused religious backgrounds. And one of the things that dragged both of us away from the church was the lack of willingness to like read the Bible and do the sorts of things that it says to do in the Bible among the church, right? With that said, right, because the Bible is pretty woke in a lot of ways. There's a lot of stuff in there about how you should give to anyone who asks, how the Christians sold what they had and shared it among each other so that whoever needed had, and whoever didn't have, right, he was provided for. You're supposed to take care of widows and orphans and foreigners. That's all in the Bible, and that's all great. That's great stuff. I think it would be fantastic if Christians believed it and acted on it. And obviously some do. But the church in America does not necessarily embody those aspects of the New Testament, right? That's the one that we're supposed to care about as Christians, because the New Testament is the new covenant. It sort of abolishes, fulfills the Old Testament. The Old Testament laws are no longer applicable. New Testament, that's where we are, right? So you can argue that, and you can say, well, that is what it was like in the Old Testament, but the new covenant, that's abolished. And I would say, well, Paul says that masters, be good to your slaves, and slaves, work hard for your masters. He doesn't say that you need to get rid of the system. It basically says mutual respect, right? But he didn't have a vision of a world where there was no slavery. And that's Paul. Paul is very, very influential in the New Testament. Some people would argue that Christianity is really from Paul more than it is from Jesus, right? It's named after Christ, but the guy who's put down most of the rules that people follow was Paul. So it could be Paulianity. Anyway, even in the New Testament, women are told to submit to men. Slavery is accepted as a fact and just a way of life. If you're a slave, be a good slave. If you're a master, be a good master. So it's not nearly as liberating and woke as we'd like to think, even though it is also sort of communist, right? So the church rejects both aspects. No, the Bible doesn't say we should do slavery, even though it does, and it was used as a reason to do slavery for a long time. Christians were doing beneficial things by enslaving people, right? And this was part of the belief for a long time. And they also reject that the Bible says we should have all things in common and we should take care of people, even people that can't help themselves, right? And it's curious. It's very frustrating. Because I like a lot of people who are Christians. My parents are Christians. My parents are very, very serious, thoughtful, generous people. And yet, they believe some really regressive stuff, and it's hard for me to sort of cope with that. And I am not alone, right? There are plenty of people who can think of all the great things that people in their church have done, and yet also would spit on a trans person, right? Or would say the N word in private, right? Talking about the people they don't like. These are complicated things to wrestle with. And slavery is seen today as sort of a historic evil, which I agree with. I absolutely think so, right? I am pretty far to the left on most social issues, and I think the idea of one human owning another human is pretty reprehensible. But that is a modern. Obviously, there have always been people who thought it was wrong, but that is more of a modern sensibility, trying to get rid of slavery, because slavery has been around in a lot of parts of the world for a very long time, right? That's the way it went. When you conquered somebody, right, a tribe or a neighboring kingdom, you impressed some of their people into labor, and their women were taken and they became wives of your men, right? There's a lot of that in the Bible. A lot of Israelite soldiers finding wives among the conquered tribes. And if you think that that is a, mutual respect, I just really liked her, and then I courted her and all that, we had a nice wedding. If you think that's what they found wives was like, you are incorrect. That is not how it functioned. A lot of sexual violence in those days, and still, but anyway, that's an aside. All right. Well, I feel like I have established my position here pretty clearly. I do know some of the arguments he's going to make because I saw them in the comments, so I will get to those. But I will address one that I know he's going to make, which is, what is the atheist's justification to not have slavery, right? Because Christians have an ethical system, a framework that convinces them that slavery is bad. And I would say, well, we fought a whole war in America specifically, where the southern half of the country was fighting for the right to keep slaves, and most of those people were Christians and went to church. So it's not entirely honest to say that Christians are the reason that slavery was abolished. Some Christians were very serious about it, and those are the people who are responsible. Not all Christians. Not everybody gets to claim that. I don't know what the atheistic framework for universal human rights is. I don't even care if it is found in the Judeo-Christian ethic. Maybe it is. That's fine. There are a lot of things that we've gotten from many religions that are valuable, even if they're philosophically valuable, even if there's no such thing as God. Right? The people who came up with them were doing it for their God, whatever their God was. And that's great. I'm fine with that. I am not somebody who would say that religion has never made a positive impact on the world, because that would be dishonest. That would be silly. But But you can't have one without the other. You can't just look at the good things Christians did and say, see, Christians have been a force for good, without looking at the bad things that Christians did and saying, that's pretty bad. That stuff, right? Manifest Destiny, that was pretty bad. Anyway, all of that to say, I am not all that concerned with basing an ethic in randomness, right? It's fine. We can say some people who are religious came up with a good idea, and I think we should stick with it, right? I am sure atheists have a better answer than I do, but I am not an atheist, and I'm not coming at this with a lot of background in proving my atheism. All right, I'm an agnostic, and I was, for much of my life, a Christian. So it's sort of hard for me to step outside of that ethical framework anyway, because it was drilled into me. Let's see what we get here.
But let's go ahead and talk about one of those subjects that atheists regularly bring up concerning Christian morality. Question number 8. Does the Bible condone slavery?
Yes. Now, I know that his answer is not yes, but I'm just going to tell you, if you do not say yes and then move on, you are lying or trying to trick. That's not me saying that he's a bad person. That's me saying, if you do not understand that the Bible condones slavery explicitly in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and you're not able to answer this question with yes, even if you followed up with a but, right? Yes, but it shouldn't. You are not being honest. The Bible absolutely, clearly condones slavery. So, I am sure that what he's going to say is, yes, it does. And we don't like that.
Now, this is an interesting fixation for atheists because, again, atheism offers no basis for anti-slavery. The best they can say is, I don't like it, and I wish you didn't either. But as far as a sturdy philosophical basis, there isn't one. Christianity, on the other hand, holds that all people are made in the image of God, and that the golden rule, treat others the way you want to be treated, is the most important rule in all of Christianity.
I would say more people think that God helps those who help themselves, which is not in the Bible. But if a man will not work, he will not eat. I think more Christians care about that verse than care about the golden rule. But that's neither here nor there. See, the thing is, he's right in one sense, right? It does say all, the Constitution, right? All men are created equal. The thing is, not everybody is a person. Black people, for example, are subhuman. So it's okay to enslave them because they're not human, right? So all humans are created equal, by which we mean white Europeans specifically. But not all beings that can walk and talk are created equal, because some of them are subhuman. I've spent many, many hours going through the videos of somebody who literally believes that, right? That black people are basically animals, right? They don't deserve the same rights because they're not as human as the rest of us. That's what he believed. That's not what Corey's talking about. I'm just saying I understand that you can both say all people are created equal and black people are worse than white people at the same time, right? Because all you have to do is say, well, black people are not human. They're sort of, they're close, but they need guidance, right? Chauvinistic, paternalistic. There was a lot of that, and most of the people who were doing that were Christians, because most of the people who existed at the time of chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade were Christians. I'm not saying they were good Christians. I'm just saying You kind of didn't exist in that world without believing in God and, the Bible, no matter if you could read or whatever. And the reason atheists pick on slavery is because it's pretty obvious how bad it was. And we fought a whole war over it, right? And a lot of the people who were leading those Confederate troops and a lot of the people who were fighting the war thought that God was on their side. You can say they were wrong for believing that, but they went to church every Sunday. They probably had more of the Bible memorized than I do, or that Corey ever has had. And also, they were fighting because they wanted slavery to continue.
Second only to our love for God himself, but the entirety of Christian morality hangs on this. And that's why the Bible, start to finish, strongly condemns violence and oppression. That's why the earliest human rights declarations began with the premise that all people are made in God's image.
The earliest human rights declaration? I mean, I assume he's talking about the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, but that's hardly the first human rights document. You could probably go back and talk about Hammurabi's code, right? The law system that he is credited with, whether he is actually the one who invented it or not. You could probably go back to that at least for an idea of human rights, but certainly not the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, whichever. Look, I did not care that much about American history or our founding documents. I don't remember if it's in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, and I don't care, frankly, because it was a lie. It only meant white people. Rewrite it, Moving on.
And are therefore endowed with certain rights. It's also why Christians and not atheists or humanists were the ones who dismantled the transatlantic slave trade. This brings us to an important point, too.
Again, you have to come back to who started the transatlantic slave trade. Was it atheists? Christopher Columbus. Was he an atheist? Or did he think he was doing God's work? Right? You can do the no true Scotsman thing, which is a common tactic, and we do it on the left as well, But it's not without precedent. But you can say, well, yeah, they were doing that, and they said they were Christians, but they weren't real Christians, right? It's pretty reasonable to want to distance yourself from that, saying well, they didn't believe the same stuff I did, or they didn't do it right. But you cannot deny that Christopher Columbus was serious about his faith. And he helped to start the transatlantic slave trade, right? So was that Christian values?
Because the word slavery in our minds is indelibly linked with the transatlantic slave trade,
it's linked with chattel slavery, the owning of other people, right? That is what it's linked with. That was a feature of the transatlantic slave trade, and not all systems that had slaves had the same sort of approach to slavery, right? But we did not invent chattel slavery in the transatlantic slave trade, okay? That was not necessarily always the way slavery functioned, but it certainly was not new.
They're traveling to other countries, kidnapping people, shipping them across the ocean, and forcing them to live in the cruelest, most dehumanizing conditions imaginable, with zero rights and zero dignity.
And who set up those laws? Who set up those rules, and who set up those circumstances? Again, we're making the argument here that Christians are to be credited for ending slavery, or for having a reason to be opposed to slavery, I guess. I would point to Haiti, who had a slave revolt and expelled the colonizers, right? And who were punished for generations for it. But Was that because they are of their Judeo-Christian values that they overthrew their oppressors? Right? It's just, you can say that many of the leading abolitionists were Christians, and that's true. I don't deny that. I don't quibble with that. It's accurate. But you also have to accept that Christians were correcting the wrongs of Christians, right? And you can talk about the Muslim slave trade, and Christians always do, but like, I'm not here saying that we should convert either, right? I take a neutral stance on gods. I don't think that any of them are real. But sure, there was slavery in Islam as well. I acknowledge that. But the slavery that existed in America and in England was Christians enslaving black people. That is what it was. So the fact that some Christians were like, boy, this system is bad. I think we should stop it. That's great, but that is a realization that what you are involved with is wrong. It's not people coming from outside of a system saying, oh, we need to change this system. If we had known about it 50 years ago, we would have changed it then. That's not what it was. It was people over the course of a few hundred years gradually realizing that you shouldn't actually own people as property. And even then, that didn't extend to women. You know, black people got the right to vote before women did. So we could talk about that too. We could talk about misogyny in the church, but we'll stick with this.
Never does the Bible condone anything remotely like this. So if the question is whether the Bible condones...
People in the comments were pointing this out. And I am just as bad because you know what? I will be better. I will be better than Corey. People were saying that Corey is not showing verses. And okay, I will show some verses. Now, we have a lot of slave talk here, you know, but you can argue that this is servants, whatever. This doesn't feel very much like servants. This feels like forced labor, right? He wants to attack us and take us as slaves. But again, there was a system within Israelite law where you could, as an Israelite, you could submit yourself to somebody else as a slave in order to pay off debts or something. But you were not lifetime, right? That it was not expected that you would be a slave forever. It was a finite period of time, and then you were free to go, according to the law. Now, were they chattel slaves in Egypt? Right? I mean, this is pretty famous, the story of the Egyptians making the Israelites make bricks and all that stuff, right? Were they slaves? It says they were slaves. Were they really more like servants, or were they slaves? Right? So this is an Exodus, which this is not historical, but it's recalling a historical time probably when the people who became the Israelite people were in captivity in Egypt. Anyway, slaves. If a priest buys a slave with money, or if slaves are born in his household, they may eat his food. Because the Israelites are my servants, they must not be sold as slaves. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. I think that's pretty explicit. I don't know how he gets around that verse, right? Because again, there's a lot of hemming and hawing over, well, it doesn't really mean like slavery like we had in America. It doesn't mean chattel slavery. It means the system of slavery that existed at the time, which was more like indentured servitude or something. You can try to make that argument, but this verse says you can bequeath them from the nations around you, right? This is 2 verses later. We'll look at this chapter 25, verse 44 through 46. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Now, this is talking about internal slaves, right? Israeli people who are, I guess, Israelite people. That's how it was at the time. Who have been placed themselves into service, right? The price for their release is to be based on the rate paid to a hired worker. So they are to be treated as workers hired from year to year. You must see to it that those whom they owe service do not rule over them ruthlessly. So there's a 2-tiered system here. If you are an Israelite, you can buy foreigners to be your servant. If you are a foreigner living in Israel, Israelites are allowed to put themselves in your service, but different rules apply. And you are not allowed to rule over them ruthlessly. Okay? So, that's very clear. Now let's go to the New Testament. Well, we're just going to have to go through this a little bit. Jeremiah, 1 Peter. So, let's see, this is talking about voluntary slavery. Obviously, a lot of this language because people are familiar with the concept of slavery at the time, right? Especially in Rome. A lot of slaves in Rome. So this makes sense. They would understand what he's talking about when he's saying, you're slaves to sin, you're slaves to God. The Spirit does not make you slaves so that you live in fear, etc. You were bought at a price. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear. Masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when they're watching, but even when they're not watching. I mean, you can try to go into the Greek and find a way to say, well, this doesn't mean slaves. Teach slaves to be subject to their masters in everything, to try to please them, not to talk back to them. I don't know how you get around these verses, right? I know how you might try to get around them. Revelation. Human beings sold as slaves. I mean, I don't know how you can reconcile that with it doesn't say anything about it, right? We've looked at the Old Testament and the New Testament, and in both places you can find explicit condoning of slavery, instructions for slaves, how to be better slaves, right, as Christians. I just don't know how you get around it.
Our modern conception of slavery, the answer is a straightforward and obvious no. It absolutely doesn't. Old Testament slaveholders were commanded to treat their slaves with dignity on the basis that all people are made in God's image.
Not in Exodus, not in Deuteronomy or wherever we were, right? What does this have to do with treat them with respect? You must not rule over your fellow Israelites, but this is about foreigners. You can buy and keep foreigners as slaves for life. What does that have to do with respect? And again, I will just note that I looked at the comments on the video. People pointed out that Corey doesn't back up his his thoughts with Bible verses. And I mean, that's fine, I guess. But I can back up my stance with verses. So where is his rebuttal to that? Because I would say, well, what about, right? I know it's bad form, but I would point to Leviticus. And I would say, well, this seems fairly clear. In Leviticus, what it's talking about is chattel slavery. How do you account for that? Because that's explicit. Again, when you read the Bible, you don't necessarily have to like or agree with everything that's in it. Although, if you're a Christian, you kind of do. You have to agree with it. But you don't have to agree that everything that's in it is good. But you cannot avoid that it's in there. You have to figure out how to deal with that. And Corey is not dealing with that.
And Israel lived under cruel, oppressive slavery in Egypt, so they should know better than to do that to others. So really...
Also, yes, that's a great idea. It would be great if people learned from history and were like, well, we didn't like that, so we're not going to do it. And sadly, tragically, I would point to what is currently happening in Gaza and the surrounding area, right, all of Palestine, as a counter argument to that, because the people currently perpetrating a genocide were victims of a genocide within living memory. Within the last 100 years, right? Within the last 80 years, there are still people alive who were alive the first time it happened. And that has not showed them that what they need to do is treat their neighbors with respect and kindness, right? That's not what's happening. So unfortunately, the idea that because it has happened to you, you should be able to avoid doing it to other people, you should understand how bad it is, that does not actually bear out in reality as like a moderating force.
If we're going to use modern words to express what was condoned in the Old Testament, it would be something that remains very common to this day. Master servant, employer employee, owner worker.
Absolutely not. Absolutely. Employer employee. I hate to go back to the well. You may buy slaves from the nations around you. You can bequeath them to your children as property and can make them slaves for life. Is that employer employee? I mean, depending on where you work, I guess it is. But it's not, right? I'm being facetious.
That dynamic doesn't offend us in principle. The reason we have such a bad taste in our mouth about the word slavery today is that the transatlantic slave trade took this owner-worker, master-servant dynamic to such oppressive and dehumanizing extremes, and people in Judeo-Christian cultures like ours don't like that kind of exploitation.
Well, they kind of do, because slavery, transatlantic slave trade started in 1619, right? The 1619 Project. We can just say early 17th century, but really it started before that because Columbus. Anyway, it wasn't abolished in the United States until 1863. I don't remember the year the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. My apologies, I should. But call it 400 years. Call it 300 years. I guess, where it was hugely profitable and it was very happily furthered, right, in America by Christians. So again, this is not like somebody said we should have slavery, and then Christians were like, how dare you? We reject that. It was somebody said we should have slavery. And then 300 years passed. And then some Christians started saying, oh, wait a minute. This doesn't seem right. But it was not. It was hundreds of years of slavery, of putting black people in zoos. Literally in zoos. That is not a joke. That is not me being like they put them on display. I mean, they put them in fucking zoos like animals. And that went on, they were a huge traction. That went on for many, many years. You can say that Christians helped put an end to it, but Christians also perpetrated and continued it for hundreds of years.
Don't get me wrong, that sort of ultra dehumanizing slavery is still tolerated to this day. We just outsource it now. All those little child cobalt miners putting iPhones in everyone's hands, or children.
Those kids are getting paid. Again, I am in no way condoning cobalt mining, right? And there is a sense of modern day slavery in, particularly in Africa, because that's one of the places that people care about human rights violations the least in the West, right? Africa is an easy place to, the legacy of colonialism and chattel slavery that has left on Africa is pretty horrifying, right? The reason those conditions exist has a great deal to do with the pillaging of Africa for hundreds of years by colonial settlers, right? And exporters. But sure, there absolutely is like slavery, but for the most part, what he's talking about is there are places where workers' conditions are not good and they're exploited. And I would say that is not the same as slavery, right? If you can quit a job, you are not a slave. If you cannot quit, you are a slave. If you are in the prison system and you are mandatorily assigned to work, that is slavery. Because you can't leave and you can't quit. You can call it they're getting paid, but it's still mandatory, right? Anyway, it's a silly argument, right? I'm coming at this totally unprepared. All right, I looked at the comments on the video, so I knew a couple of the angles he was going to take, but I did not prepare for this. But this is very, very easy to refute, to respond to. It is kind of embarrassing. This is weak. This is very weak.
And sweatshops putting inexpensive clothes on their backs.
Right,
which,
sweatshops.
By the way, if you're an atheist who's really worked up about slavery, you could always spend your time and energy combating modern slavery rather than throwing rocks at the religion that dismantled the transatlantic slave trade. Because yes, the first people to publicly declare just how wrong the transatlantic slave trade was were Christians. 1688, Germantown Quaker petition against slavery.
And slavery was abolished that next month in 1689. I try to be consistent in what I say and the points I make. I agree. Some Christians were outspoken even early on. There have been people who have been opposed to slavery basically throughout all of history. They don't necessarily get talked about or make the history books, but in every culture, there are people who thought it was wrong, right? So, sure, I concede this point. I am happy to agree. There are some Christians who are opposed to slavery. John Brown should be a national hero, okay? John Brown was driven by his Christianity and possible schizophrenia, but he was a man who believed so strongly that slavery should not exist that he started a slave revolt and got himself killed. Okay? I 100% honor his commitment to do something about an institution that he knew was wrong. I respect that immensely. And he was driven by his faith. And also that was another 15, 20 years before slavery was abolished in America. The people who abolished the slave trade in Haiti were the Haitians, who were not driven by their Christianity, right? They were driven by the being slaves and being oppressed, right? Great. There was a guy in 1688 who thought that slavery was bad. When did the Civil War happen? Almost 200 years later. I guess he didn't make that much of an impact. Not that he was wrong, and not that we should dismiss his willingness to speak out against the popular culture of the day, because I'm sure that took bravery to do, and all credit to him for that. But it didn't change things. And an awful lot of the perpetration of slavery was done by Christians. You have to reckon with that.
Strongly denounces slavery.
Because everybody was a Christian. The entire culture was Christian of one flavor or another. So everybody was a Christian, which means that everybody involved in slavery were Christians. And everybody pushing back against slavery were Christians, pretty much, right? With some exceptions. So it's not like Christians were pushing back against the atheists that were keeping slaves. They were pushing back against other Christians that were keeping slaves, or profiting off of slaves, or buying and selling, right? That was the way it was. It was not like all these a-religious folks who had all the money. That was not the makeup of society in the 1700s.
On the grounds of the Golden Rule, treating others the way you would want to be treated. How would you like it, they argued, if someone stole you from your wife and children, shipped you to a foreign country, and treated you worse than livestock? It's indefensible on basic Christian values.
I mean, I feel like I keep going back to this verse, but this verse is not subtle. This verse is not like difficult to parse. This straight up says you can buy slaves from the nations around you, and you can give them to your children as an inheritance. You can keep them slaves for life. That is chattel slavery. What, right? How else? You could say that the relationships were supposed to be a certain way, but that's not in the text. The text only deals with really Israelites as slaves. Anyway, we'll go back to this.
That's the argument first made in the Quaker Petition, and it's the argument that ultimately dismantled slavery. Conversely, yet again, nothing in atheism can get you there, which I don't have to say in theory. Scour world history and good luck finding any successful atheistic human rights movement.
I don't exactly know how I would go about disproving this, but I would also just say, like, for many thousands of years, there really was no such thing as an atheist. Everybody believed in God or gods or energy, or right. So every movement has been religious because everybody was religious, pretty much without fail. And only in the last 150 years, really, has there been a concern, maybe 200, 300 years, right? You had the Enlightenment and people were getting more abstract with religion, but really, it's only been in the last few hundred years that there has been anything like even an atheist, like a word for it, somebody who didn't believe in God. Because you couldn't not believe God was real. You couldn't not believe in God. You might not agree that the God that I believe in and the God that you believe in are talking about the same thing, but you believe in God because God is real, right? There is no debate about it. And then people start asking questions about it. Oh, what if God isn't real? Right? And then you start to have an actual counterforce to the religion of the day. But that's a recent development in the scheme of world history. So you could easily point to non-Christian human rights movements, right? You could do that, but I don't know if you can with atheism, and that's kind of fine because I would say probably women's rights is one of the main things that has come from a more secular worldview. The civil rights movement obviously largely came out of the church. The anti-slavery movement came out of the church. I'm fine with that, right? It's great. It's great that they decided to end an institution that they had been propping up for hundreds of years. It fucking took them long enough.
Some will try and argue that human rights are a product of the Enlightenment, implying that human rights came out of something atheistic or at least religiously neutral, but that's just wrong. Post-Enlightenment Christianity brought...
Cite your sources, goddammit. You are asserting a claim. People will say that it's because of the Enlightenment. They are wrong. Okay? You are a lawyer. Cite something. Give me some reference, some outside source. Preferably one that's not from an apologist. That's because, not that apologists can't do good work, but they are biased by very nature of what they're doing, right? You are trying to prove that God is real or that your God is real. That's apologetics, and it's fine to do, but it does not come from a place of neutrality. So I would love to see an argument from a neutral saying, people argue, like Bart Ehrman, okay? Bart Ehrman's an atheist, but he does acknowledge that it seems like the first free hospitals and the idea of taking care of the poor, that seems to have come out of Christianity, right? Fine. I'm fine. I'm happy to acknowledge that. But you are just asserting a claim with no source and no backup. And that is weak.
The world unprecedented human rights, including the end of slavery, all based in the idea of people being made in the image of God. Human rights...
Again, did the Haitians have the same Judeo-Christian worldview about human rights? Or were they just tired of being slaves? Because they ended the slave trade in Haiti themselves. They killed a lot of people to do it. Was that because of their Judeo-Christian ethics?
Grew out of that idea. Post-Enlightenment atheism brought some of the greatest human atrocities the world has ever seen. To quote historian Jeffrey Burton Russell, atheist rulers such as Lenin, Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, and Pol Pot tortured, starved, and murdered more people.
Who's Jeffrey Burton Russell? Let's see. He has stuff about... Oh, I've looked at him before. Historian of medieval Europe and religious studies scholar. Several books about the devil. Interesting. I mean, it is well known today that people knew the world was round. I don't know why this would be anti-Christians that were responsible for that, but okay. I mean, it doesn't seem to be aggressively refuted here, so I don't know enough to say otherwise. What is this? Atheist rulers such as Lenin and Hitler. Some of these people may not have been atheists. I am certainly not going to condone the works of Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, or Pol Pot. Lenin's a little bit of a different case, but I'm fine saying that he was responsible for some atrocities. Part of Mao Zedong's problem was famine, of course. Part of it was on purpose. But all the combined religious regimes of the world, the only reason that could be true is because there were a lot more people on Earth in the 20th century than there were in the 10th century. Populations were much larger because people lived longer and had better medicine. So per capita, is this true? Right. Because, yeah, these people were atheists, but they were not all people who believed the same things, right? Zedong was a communist, but Hitler wasn't. Hitler was really into the occult, so was he an atheist? Right? I mean, again, I'm not really trying to split hairs on this, but I do think this claim is dubious. I would like to see some numbers, right? Because this just, again, now we have a quote that is an assertion, and I'm sure Jeffrey Burton Russell had some data. All right, he must have had some data. I'm going to assume he did a good work, but we don't see that data. So all I can see is this is an assertion that is probably also anti-communist beyond just being anti-atheist.
People in the 20th century than all the combined religious regimes of the world during the previous 19 centuries.
How many people did Winston Churchill kill in India? How many people did the British Raj kill in India? Right? Now, that was not atheistic. 125 million excess deaths in India between 1880 and 1920. 125 million. That's just India. That does not incorporate like the Crusades or the pogroms throughout the Middle Ages, right? The anti-Jewish pogroms specifically. So I would, and now look, yeah, Lenin, Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, and Pol Pot, they did kill a lot of people. They had pretty massive population bases to draw from in order to do that. England was not that populated in the 10th century, right? Like, so again, if we're talking about per capita, if we're talking about adjusted for inflation, if you will, okay. But we also have to talk about things like the British Raj, right? Things like the American extermination of Native Americans, the colonial impact in places like the Caribbean. How many people? It just this is not compelling. It sort of sounds good, but there's no numbers behind it. There's no data, so it's an assertion.
So that's post-Enlightenment atheism for you. The strong crushing the weak.
And that is such a weak, man. So I read this quote, and that's post-Enlightenment atheism for you. Come on, man. Again, I have to believe you are better than this.
Stems very naturally from this belief that we are simply the genetic victors of a long process of kill or be killed. That's why it's so ironic to me, all this atheistic outrage over slavery in the Old Testament. O'Connor, for instance, is fond of quoting one of my favorite Christian leaders, Abraham Lincoln, who said, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." And O'Connor then will point out that slavery is found in the Bible, ignoring, of course, all the nuances that we've already discussed.
All the nuances that we have discussed, but the verses that we have not dealt with, right? I keep coming back to that because I don't know what nuance you can get out of this verse. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. I don't know where the nuance is there. Now, I didn't go to the seminary, so maybe there's something in there that I am just not educated enough to know. But this seems pretty straightforward.
But in atheist distaste for the cruelty of slavery, they tried to dismantle Christianity, the very movement that ended the transatlantic slave trade. And further, they try to dismantle all hope for justice for any who've already perished under that kind of oppression. So many people have already reached the end of their lives and seen zero justice. How many in the transatlantic slave trade died before the ships even reached the U.S.? How many?
A lot. Although, because they were valuable, they did try to prevent that. But I've read some interesting stuff recently about the transatlantic slave trade, sort of circumstantially, right? About other stuff that was going on in Africa at the same time. And, sometimes you were not getting healthy people sold to you, right? or seized, right? Because it's true. There were plenty of collaborators who were like, well, listen, this is a good way for us to get a leg up on the tribe that we've been at war with, right? So there is some of that. But you weren't necessarily getting the healthiest people, and some of them did die. The conditions they were kept in were not good. They did generally try to keep them from dying, because if they're dying, they're not worth any money, which is why they were getting them in the first place. So they were incentivized to not kill the slaves before they sold them, right? It is horrible, but yeah, you don't want to come back with a ship full of dead people, because then you lost money on your trip.
Many child slaves to this day die before ever reaching adulthood under those brutal conditions. On atheism, that's just tough luck. They lived a nasty, brutish, and short existence, but hey, that's life. On Christianity, those...
Also, I think that this is painting atheists with a bit of a broad brush. I mean, I think he is saying that's atheism, but atheism is not so much a philosophical, set of ideas as much as it is, I don't believe that there's such a thing as a God. So, an atheist is anybody who doesn't believe that God is real. It doesn't mean that they agree with each other, right? There are many people on many different sides of the spectrum who don't believe there's a God. But that does not mean that they agree with the person next to them who also doesn't believe there's a God on things like ethics. So what he's really getting at is Darwinianism, right? Survival of the fittest, law of the jungle type stuff. I do not think that that is necessarily a hallmark of your average atheist. Prove me wrong. Maybe that's what 99 out of 100 atheists believe, is just, if you die as a child in a mine, that's too bad. But I would be surprised if that is true.
Dude died so cruelly will see justice done. Everyone will. Slaves and slaveholders alike, everything gets set right. So O'Connor says, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong, apparently failing to notice that if he and his fellow atheists are right, then everything is right, slavery included.
Paul said everything is permitted. That doesn't mean everything is beneficial, but everything is permitted. That's what Paul said. I mean, that's in the Bible. So, again, that's cherry picking a little bit. Paul was very against a great many things. But he did talk about grace and what it's like to live under grace, under the new covenant. And so I could point to that and say, well, I can do whatever I want. Paul said it's not all beneficial, but it's all permitted. So that means it's permitted. It means it's allowed, right? In America, we know that alcohol is a poison. We know that it's bad for you. There's really no positive effects to drinking. But you are allowed to do it. It's legal. Okay, so am I allowed to make that decision because it's legal? Well, yeah, but it's not good for you. But I'm allowed to make it, right? Yes. Okay. Paul says everything is permitted. Yeah, but not everything's good for you. Fair enough, Paul. Everything is not good for me, but everything is permitted. So, I guess I can do it, right? Anyway, I just said that's cherry picking, and I know it is. But he's arguing that atheists say that basically everything is permitted. So I can make that same argument from the Bible,
So, does the Bible condone slavery?
Yes.
No. Slavery was
Boy, such a layup. This is such a layup to just say, it does, but I disagree with it, and here's why. It does, but it means something different, and here's how I justify that. Here's how I harmonize it. But this is not ambiguous. This is not servants. This is not employer-employee, like he suggested. This is, you can buy slaves from the nations around you, and you can give them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. That is not subtle. That is direct not just acceptance, but here's how you do it. When you buy slaves, here's how you do it. You can't oppress your fellow Israelites, but you can oppress people from other countries. That's what it's saying. All right. And we have looked at the New Testament as well. Paul specifically, because he wrote most of the New Testament. He wrote some of the New Testament, and other books are attributed to him. But he wrote several letters, and in those letters to the Romans, to the Galatians, to the Colossians, he talks about slaves and masters. Slaves, be good to your masters. Work hard for your masters even when they're not looking. Masters, treat your slaves with respect. Right? Now, that's great. It's great to say don't just abuse your slaves. But Paul did not conceive of a system in which there was not slavery beyond saying in Christ there is no slave or free, right? As Christians, you don't have to, you're not bound by your social class. That doesn't mean you don't have to be a slave, right? It's just that it's like the caste system, right? It's not that you're not a slave. It's that you can talk to people who are in a different social class. And because you're both in Christ, you both have equal access, right? So that doesn't mean you have to sit at the back in church or something. How well this has been applied in Christian life is not well. But that is sort of the conception, right? It's not really about your earthly circumstances. Christianity is an apocalyptic movement. That's what Jesus was. Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher, and Paul also thought the end was coming soon. Like the literal end within my lifetime soon, because Jesus said some of the apostles won't die before I return in my glory or whatever. I don't remember the exact verse. But all that to say, Paul did not conceive of a world where slaves and masters did not exist presently. He conceived of a spiritual world where, because we're all in Christ, we're all equal in that sense, but not on earth, not in the physical world, right? And so, like, this is just worse than most. And I know I'm going hard on it. And it's not like he's saying particularly offensive stuff. You know, slavery was good, right? He's not saying anything like that. It's not really, it's not that bad, but it's very irritating because these are simple rebuttals, right? I know there's stuff about it in the Bible. I searched slaves and I found a bunch of verses. That is, 10 seconds of work on my part. And I found a verse that says, you can buy foreigners and pass them down to your children. To me, that is a clear acceptance and condoning of chattel slavery. How do you respond? Right? The only way to deflect that is to say something about how the Bible does talk about slavery, but it was a different system and a different time, and Christians realized that it was bad. But he doesn't really do that. I mean, he talks a lot about how Christians realized it was bad. He doesn't talk at all about how Christians set up and perpetrated the system. But okay, some Christians did realize it was bad, even in the 1600s. That's great, but that's hardly, the Bible does not condone slavery. They used the Bible to justify slavery. So it's just like that objection is not hard to knock down, but at least it shows nuance. And this flat rejection that the Bible condones slavery when it very clearly does is, it's deceptive, right? Surely I know he's read the Bible. I know he's read it all the way through, front to back. I bet he reads his Bible every morning, and I commend him for that, right? I'm not here to dunk on him for not knowing the Bible. I'm sure he does know the Bible. But How do you know the Bible and not know this stuff? How do you so confidently say the Bible does not condone slavery when it says the priests can buy slaves? It's disappointing because it feels like he didn't make much of an effort. I understand this is part of a larger video, right? There's a 45-minute video where he responds to, I guess, Alex O'Connor and the Jubilee atheists, right? The people who are dunking on Jordan Peterson. I have not watched that video. I probably won't. I do not. Look, I respect Corey intellectually. I think he has worked hard. He went to law school. He went to seminary. That's why I have higher standards. I expect him to do better than this. This is weak. This is weak. This is easily pushed back against. And easily counterfactuals are found, right? You say this is confidently true, but it's not. And it's so easy to find that it disappoints me, right? It's just like, I thought it would be harder for me, right? Again, he went to law school. He went to seminary. I just have an undergrad. I have a minor in Bible, right? Those are my qualifications. I expect to have to do some more heavy lifting to push back on some of these arguments. And I just don't. It does not require very much energy on my part to push back on this stuff. Yeah, well, listen, Jim knew more about the Old Testament than Corey does. Because he was using it to justify why black people should be slaves. Right? Like, I don't know what you think is so different about it, or what discourse you think I'm gonna get wrapped into. I have mentioned to Corey I'd be happy to talk. Right, again, I know I said I don't like debate perverts, and I don't. But I would be happy to talk to Corey about this stuff. He has commented on a couple of the videos that I've done, and because I'm not trying to like, oh yeah, well, here's one, not the pocket watch. My views aren't that great, but this is not like the largest of platforms. If I was to be responded to, but I have messaged Corey about the videos. I have told him that I have responded to his videos, and he has not responded. He's not responded to my responses. He has left comments that he's looking forward to watching the videos that I have put up. I don't know if he has watched them. He has not discussed them, right? We can look at his Atheists versus Christians. This is O'Connor and Jordan Peterson. This is about lawyers suing Trump. That has nothing to do with me. The Philosophy of Middle Earth has nothing to do with me. This is the one that I responded to. So if he was going to have responded to me, it would have been after this video, right? It would have been in the last few months, and he has not. That's fine, right? He doesn't owe me a response. I'm not really that worried about it. But he has yet to engage with the things I have said. So, I'm not holding my breath. I would be interested in having a conversation about it. We have had conversations on Facebook about it, and those were not particularly productive. Again, with the laziness accusations, right? He tried to make the argument to me that all of the great scientific advancements are because of Christians, which I am not accusing him of coming at this with a specific mindset. But that is the exact sort of thing that Jim has said. And it is a common argument on the extreme right wing that all the good stuff in the world is because of white people. Right now, he said Christians, I said white people. You understand that for many people that is the same, right? That's the Venn diagram is a circle. It's two hands shaking each other, Christians and white. And I just brought up like China. What about China? What about all the stuff that came from China? What about all the stuff that came from Islamic science, right? And the Greeks, who were not Jewish or Christian, and who mostly survived because of the Islamic discovery and incorporation of Greek philosophy and medicine and science. So that's not Christian. Neither one of those groups of people are Christian. And the list of accomplishments and advancements in China is extraordinarily long. What about the Egyptians, right? They weren't Christians. They didn't have a Judeo-Christian worldview, and they pushed stuff forward. And then you say, what about things like the repression of science? Again, there are so many things that you can point to refute that argument. It is barely worth doing, but it shows a real lack of thoughtfulness. And it's embarrassing. I would be embarrassed if I was that poorly informed. And in fairness, I probably did used to be that poorly informed, right? I have tried to learn more things that are not directly related to my experience growing up in the church. I've tried to expand my horizons to some degree, and I don't know. I know that what he told me is that he had some doubts theologically, so he went to seminary, and now he's an apologist. So I don't know if he dealt with those doubts in the most honest of ways, right? I'm just saying, I expect better from somebody who went to law school. You should know how to make a tight argument. And I bet again, in fairness, I bet when he's sitting down and he's got his reference book and he's working on a case and he's pulling together ways to defend the case, right? I'm sure he does a better job. And I'm sure, because like a judge is not going to put up with it. You need to have references. If you're going to say, this is in violation of X, Y, or Z, you need to have a precedent that you can point to. So I'm sure he does a better job when it comes to his day job. But this is lazy. And it is something that I have noticed the entire time we have had conversations about this stuff. But he does. I know he does. Because he talks about being in a courtroom. Anyway, even if you don't argue in court, you should be able to think like a lawyer, right? Thinking like a lawyer is writing tight arguments, backing up your claims with sources, saying, here is what I believe, and I am backed up in this belief by this case, this source, this precedent. There's not a lot of source referencing in these videos, or saying that Christians are responsible for all of the scientific advancements. It's just ignorant. And what it is, again, there are plenty of great people in the South. There are plenty of great people who grew up without a lot of access to education, or their education was tailored a certain way because of being born in the South. But I know where Corey is from, and I am willing to believe that some of the things Corey believes are the things he grew up with in church in small town Arkansas. And I think he has not interrogated those. And as a result, I don't find his arguments very convincing or compelling. Think he's I don't think he's that good of an apologist. And I just, yeah, it's frustrating. Because again, I'm like gearing up. I'm gonna have to be on top of it. I'm gonna have to not be baked to deal with this. And yet, that has not been the case. I have been able to deal with these sorts of arguments with very little effort and medicated. Anyway, I want to spar, right? I enjoy the sparring. My career counselor told me that I should be a lawyer because I like to argue and I like to make good points and make tight arguments. I enjoy that, right? From a technical aspect of just showing that you have a command of the material. But I have not had to show much command of anything. You know, it's like playing basketball with a 9-year-old. All right, you're trying hard, but I really don't have to work much to score. It's just not hard. I don't know who that is. Andrew Wilson. Is he? I assume he's an apologist. I was talking to Bethany the other day. Which is he? The guy with the beard? That guy? Huh. Wow, he seems like an asshole. I don't even think I want to watch this guy talk because he looks like he sucks. Oh, so he's just like one of those inflammatory style I'm going to take a contrarian stance and I'm going to pretend that it's common sense. Yeah, I pass. Anyway, come on, Corey. Work harder. And like, look, I'll just show you some of the comments just so people are less generous than I am. We didn't hear one verse from the Bible. That's interesting. Thousands of words in the Old Testament laws. Instructions tell us to get slaves from other nations. It's true Christians were part of abolishing slavery, but they had to argue with, this guy didn't read Exodus 21 or Leviticus 25. Hey, look, Leviticus 25. Let's see what he says about Leviticus 25. I do not find this convincing. They're nothing remotely comparable to the transatlantic slave trade in the sense that you couldn't cross the Atlantic, sure. In the sense that you were purchasing human beings as property and could pass them down to your children as an inheritance. That is exactly the same. Right? I mean, again, this is here's the dodge, all right? Here's the dodge. Violence has always been wrong. All things permitted or even commanded. They were always wrong, but sometimes they were permitted or commanded as lesser evils. How is that? How can you possibly believe that to be true? God is perfect. God says, be perfect as I am perfect. Right? That's what Jesus says. Jesus is credited with saying in the New Testament. If God is perfect, then how can God make laws for people that are not perfect, right? That are not expecting perfection? divorce was permitted. And then Jesus said, you're not supposed to divorce, right? Because that wasn't the point. Adultery was a property crime. Okay? Adultery was not sexual immorality. It was a property crime against somebody else's property, the woman in question. Like, was that just always wrong and permitted? Because why would God permit it? God can't be around evil. God can't be around sin. I've heard this argument before, okay, and it doesn't scan to me. If God was making the rules for his specific people, his special people, why is he allowing them to not fall? Like, why would he allow them to have an out? Also, violence is always wrong. Violence is not. This one is also ridiculous. My partner is a pacifist. She has a universal life ethic, right? And I agree that she can be a pacifist, and I think that it is admirable. But to say violence is always wrong, well, slaves wouldn't be free without violence. Was it wrong? Slavery was wrong, but then violence was wrong. So does the second wrong, is that acceptable because of the first wrong? Should we have joined up World War II, right? Was it wrong when God commanded the Israelites to wipe out the people around them and leave none alive, not even the livestock? Was that wrong? Because God commanded it. He didn't have to command total annihilation, right? But that's in the Old Testament. So was it wrong? If God said it, it's not wrong. And God said that you could keep people as slaves as long as they're not Israelites. So is it wrong? Like, hopefully you are understanding the contradiction. I don't think this is complicated. I don't think I'm getting too esoteric with it. But it's silly. This is silly. Violence has always been wrong? Well, no, it hasn't, because the Bible explicitly commands, not just condones, genocidal violence. The Bible condones slavery. The Bible condones women being physical property. Was that wrong? Because it's in the Bible. And anyway, look, we've all got blind spots. We all think we have great arguments until somebody brings up a response, a counter to that argument. And then you have to figure out if you do actually have a good argument or not. I have seen some of the responses from Corey. Is God limited to the fucking better of two evils? He's God. He created the universe with his thoughts. Why is he artificially constrained by what he can tell people to do? That is weak. I keep coming back to it. It is lazy and weak. And boy, I mean, I guess I hope that apologists are being taught this way, because it is very easy to respond to and to point out the flaws. But this is embarrassing. Anyway, that'll be it for today. If somebody else wants to clip it, you're welcome to. I am not really that interested in generating a debate or creating outrage. You know, even if I think Corey is being intellectually lazy, I don't feel the need to, like, start a fight. But I would be interested in going back and forth with him on some of this stuff and seeing how he responds to these questions. Because I just don't know. I don't know that he has one. But we'll see. You know, maybe he will. He hasn't uploaded in a while, so maybe he's busy. Maybe he'll get around to one of my videos, and he will think that I made some interesting points, right? I try to stay away from, like, personal attacks or attacking religion or Christians. There are a lot of Christians who are great wonderful people who work hard and love the Lord and just want to serve and make the world a better place. I freely acknowledge that. I don't think that people who are Christians are morons or, all hypocrites. I just think that his version of apologetics is not very convincing. As somebody who was a Christian, I can argue with him from the side of being a former Christian. It doesn't even have to come from secular sources. It's just I can go to the Bible and say, how do you square this? Anyway, we went to church on Sunday with my parents, which is interesting. It's always interesting to go back to church. And one of the things I was thinking about, and this will sound a little bit dismissive, and so it's not meant to be. It's more of a big picture sort of thing that I have come to realize. This scrolling wheel is not the best background. Basically, all of religion is just magic words. Christians, Muslims, Hindus, it's all magic words, right? I am looking for the right collection of things to say in the right order so that I can speak things into the world so that they will happen, right? If I pray the correct way, if I have the right mantra, if I have the right, verse that I can quote, then what I want to happen will happen. I will have control, right? I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that Christianity is unique in this. And in Christianity, it looks a little bit different because also mostly we understand it in English, right? And some magic words sound like nonsense words, or they come from different religious traditions. And we're like, well, that's silly, obviously. You don't need to say this mantra over and over again. What you need to do is pray. How different is praying from a mantra? It's basically not, right? I'm going to quote this verse that says, ask for, Lord, you said when two people ask in your name, then you will grant their request. And so we are asking in your name, right? That's the magic word. That's the phrase. The phrase is Jesus, in Jesus' name, in the name of the Son, right? Again, that's the magic phrase that is supposed to make things happen for you. And it's interesting. I mentioned this in the group chat. What was that? Mark 11:5, I think. Let's see if this will just bring us to Mark. Nope. There we go. Mark 11. Not 5. Yeah, Mark 11, 22 through 24, 25. Have faith in God. I tell you, if anyone says to this mountain, go throw yourself into the sea, and does not doubt it in their heart, but believes that what they say will happen, it will be done for them. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. Now, in my tradition, we did not agree with the, it's called the prosperity gospel, right? The idea that belief in God will make you rich. All you got to do is sow your seeds and pray your prayers, and God will make you rich. We don't believe in that because we had a more apocalyptic view, right? It's not about this world. It's about the next world. It's about the future and the spiritual world. But this verse says, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. That feels pretty much like, well, if I pray for something and I believe that God's going to give it to me, then God will give it to me. If I, let's see. If I believe that God is going to heal my sick wife or grandmother or child, then he will. But he doesn't. And then you have to reconcile that with what the verse says. Let's see, where is the prayer of a righteous man? I can't remember the verse. James 5:16. Okay. Pray for one another that you may be healed. Confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The heartfelt and persistent prayer of a righteous man can accomplish much. This sure sounds like he's saying, if you pray for each other, then you will be healed. Because the prayer of a righteous man is powerful. And there are an awful lot of people that get prayed for by an awful lot of really committed Christians who are not healed. And does that mean God is lying? Right? Does that mean that this means something else? Because it has to mean something else, because it seems like a promise. Do this. This is an interesting translation. Where's the New Revised? Do we have the New Revised in here? New International Revised Version, New Revised Standard Version. So that you may be healed. The prayer of the righteous is powerful and effective. Therefore, make a confession of sin and intercede on behalf of each other so that you may have complete healing. It's not that ambiguous, right? But it's difficult to address this verse that says if you say the right magic words, you will not be sick anymore. With, I thought I said the right magic words, and they still died. Anyway, I just was thinking about that. I think that it's all magic words. It's all magical thinking. I am trying to harness the forces of the universe in a way that benefits me. Life is chaotic and I don't have control. But if I know the right magic words, I can have some control. I can make sure that my travels are safe. If I have the right pendant, if I have the right tattoo, if I have the right Bible verse on my, I can't remember what they're called. The box, the scripture that people wear on their heads. If I have that, if I say the right words, then I will have control over what's happening in the world around me, this very chaotic and unpredictable world. And that's what this verse promises. And yet, people only talk about how prayer made a difference when people get better. Nobody talks about how the prayer didn't work, right? And it's frustrating because, I don't know. I am not anti-religion, but I do think it's very easily explained by saying everybody wants to have more confidence that things are going to go well, that their life is going to be okay, that the people they care about are going to be safe, right? Everybody wants to have control of that, and we don't. You could walk outside and get hit by a bus. Your mom could walk outside and get hit by a bus. But if I say the right magic words, if I have the right mantra, if good people, right, who have good karma, if they are blessing me and saying that they hope that my life will be good, then it will be, and I have control. And even if I don't have control, God has control, right? So I know that stuff happens. It's not just random. There's a plan. God has a plan, even if I don't understand it. And that is reassuring, right? That is compelling for a lot of people. It is not compelling for me anymore. I do not find comfort in that. The world is scary, and random, and bad things happen all the time to good people. People get sick and die. People become disabled seemingly out of nowhere, right? People get MS. We don't even know how to treat it. I think we're making progress on MS, but people get these terminal illnesses that we can't do anything about. Well, why doesn't God intercede? Anyway, that'll be it for today. I'm gonna wrap it up and go out and enjoy the weather. But thanks for watching. It's fun when I can have a little bit of a back and forth and have a conversation, because I don't have a lot of that in my daily life. And hopefully I did not come across as insensitive or rude. Dismissive I can live with. I can handle that, but I don't want to be rude. I don't want to be unkind. Even if I'm criticizing. But that'll do it. Thanks for hanging out. And I may stream again this week, tomorrow.